All right, hi everybody. This is Paul Sargent again, and welcome back to AP Government. Today we're going to talk about the mass media and the political agenda. And really today, our two goals, we're going to talk about what the mass media is and how it's developed over time. So let's go ahead and get going. First of all, just a little introduction here of what it is. Mass media refers to all those ways that information gets out to the people. This includes television, radio, newspapers, magazines, the internet, and of course nowadays more and more means of popular communication. This can include Twitter, this can include Tumblr, this can include Facebook, more and more ways that people are getting their information every single day. And of course this is all about high tech. More and more over time, politics has become high tech. It's been shaped by the increasing technology, made it cheaper and easier for politicians to reach the people and have a platform to talk about what they stand for or what they believe in, but also has made it easier for us to communicate with policymakers. So we've both used this, both citizens and policymakers, in order to make the whole system a little bit more effective, I guess. What can we say about it today? Well, if people want to be successful in politics, they have to be able to express themselves through media well. We've seen a lot of people who make media gaffes, and a gaffe is when someone does something that or says something that isn't quite right. They may or they may not mean it. It just comes out the wrong way, and all of a sudden the media is all over them. But good media personalities who have a good idea of how to work with media, how to communicate through media, they need that these days in order to be successful. So people, especially politicians, will hold what are called media events, all right? And these are specifically designed and choreographed events that are staged for the media but look spontaneous, Here's Barack Obama deciding to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the March in Selma. It looks very spontaneous. Lots of people show up. It's very spontaneous. But of course, all of this has been planned ahead of time, way ahead of time, in order to make a good scene. Because let's face it, spontaneous doesn't work. If a politician just shows up with no announcement, people don't know they're there and they can't show up. And so they hold these media events and they invite the media to come in and cover them. All right. Almost anyone, of course, can stage these things. And how you use them and what you do with them can really shape your image. If you use them well, then people are going to look at you favorably. If you don't use them well, then people aren't going to look at you favorably. And ultimately, in a democracy, you want the people to look at you as a politician very favorably in what you do, and then show that you care about everybody, and look through those. So how has it developed over time? Well, obviously, when you go back to the days of the Founding Fathers, media wasn't really important. Newspapers didn't really exist in the way they do today. There was no television, there was no internet, there was no radio, there was nothing like that. Today, politicians use press conferences as a good way of getting out information. This is where they call in reporters, and public officials then have some sort of conversation with them. Well, more or less of a conversation, and more of a, here's the message I want to give you, and maybe I'll take some questions depending on what exactly I'm saying. Franklin Roosevelt was like the pioneer in all of this. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was certainly an exceptional president, but he also came along at a time when radio was really becoming almost universal. I mean, people around the United States had, or at least had, access to radios, and so he made use of those. He also had access to news footage on newsreels before movies. So he held a lot of these press conferences, and a lot of it had to do with the Great Depression and trying to reassure everybody, make sure everybody thought everything was okay and all of that. We also have to understand what investigative journalism is. And this is kind of like in-depth reporting that's used by media to unearth scandals, scams, and schemes. And whereas politicians are always trying to bring media and politicians together, Media are investigating things that they think might be going wrong in investigative journalism. Sometimes they uncover some pretty crazy things. The classic textbook example is the Watergate scandal. Typically, presidential candidates get less favorable coverage than they used to. A couple great examples. Franklin Roosevelt, the press had an unspoken little agreement with him. They never showed him in a wheelchair. When he had to stand up out of that wheelchair with help, they wouldn't film that. JFK was certainly not the most faithful of husbands, and yet the media kind of let that go because he was president of the United States. These days, no, they're all over it. And part of it has to do with 24-hour news, and part of it has to do with other considerations. So what sort of media do we have? Well, there's print media. This is becoming less and less popular. So I'm going to kind of move through this quickly. We're talking about newspapers and magazines here, which are really starting to cut back. Around the turn of the century, this being the 20th century here, there was a period of what was called yellow journalism, which is like really sensationalist stories, big headlines, trying to like get public fervor up. In fact, the Spanish-American War was largely blamed on the use of yellow journalism, and like they kind of blew everything out of proportion and made it so that people like really wanted to go to war with Spain. But there's a pecking order among newspapers, your local newspaper that covers, the wrestling team and shows the honor roll and stuff like that. It's low on the pecking order. The New York Times is kind of the number one newspaper of the United States. In general, the Washington Post is typically seen as being like the big political newspaper because they're in Washington and that's where national politics are. But this is declining. It's largely being replaced, and this has taken a long time, by broadcast media, television and radio, right? Now in the days prior to the internet, prior to cable, when there were certain broadcast stations, this was a big thing. And it brought the news into people's homes. And when you only had 3 channels or 4 channels, and all of them were showing news at the same time, people tended to watch the news all of the time, at that time. And so they got lots of news. Nowadays, we have more choices. But, this brings the Vietnam War into people's homes. It really lets people like see politicians, and if they appear right, if they have mannerisms that people don't like, they can cause some problems. Like Nixon had problems in the Kennedy debate. Kennedy looks all young and energetic, and Nixon didn't. But there has to be some regulation here of what's going on. The FCC is like the Federal Communications Commission. They're in charge of overseeing the use of airways. And they really do 3 things. Number one, they don't want a near monopoly control of a market. You don't want one person who's sending out the message on every television station, every radio station, every newspaper in a single area. That's bad. So they prevent that. They review how stations do in terms of, what they show and what they cover and all of that. And then there's fair treatment rules for politicians. You can't have news stations in a local market which are very biased. Now, the rules on cable are a little less stringent, and, some channels get away with being, let's say, fair and balanced. But of course, cable news made a real change here. Now, what cable news did is like it focuses on really particular audiences, because you can have one channel and you zoom in. You've got conservative channels, you've got liberal channels, C-SPAN, they cover Congress all the time. Not a lot of people watch it, but they can certainly focus more on that thing. With 24-hour news, though, you need to have lots of stories. But, politicians rely on this news because they can see what's happening all the time. But, hey, there's limited resources. And if you're running a 24-hour news channel, you don't have that much to work with. All right. And the internet, of course, is the big one. The internet, it's being used in a lot of different ways. We can choose what we want to see. We can choose what we want to listen to. We can choose what we want to read. That's in our control, and that's the value of the internet. But the thing is, if it's not being fed to us, what studies find is that most people don't use the internet for political information. And if they do, they use it for political information. It's being passed on things like Facebook and Twitter by people who feel the same way as they do. All right. We also have blogs where people talk about their feelings. So that's basically it. We'll move on to some more media next.